Hello everyone, welcome to the 15th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are in the 6th week of this course, NPTEL course on Sociology of Development, and we are discussing the third phase of modernization theory through the works of Ashish Kothari, Escobar, Saleh, Demaria, Acosta and so on. Okay. In the last class, what we have discussed, if you slightly recall, we have discussed how theories of modernization are explicitly or implicitly theories of capitalist development, and in the last class we have discussed finding pluriversal paths. Okay. I mean, when I say finding pluriversal paths, I mean I tend to or rather I intend to use the term political, that is a collaboration among dissenting voices over the kinds of alternative worlds that we want to create. The distinction between global north and global south is not simply based on geographical locations, rather it has significant economic and geopolitical implications. Then we have discussed altered globalization alliances, how there is a misconception that development is linear, unidirectional material and financial growth driven by commodification and capitalist markets. Development in relation to traditional discrimination and violence against women, youth, children, intersex minorities, landless and unemployed classes, races, castes and ethnicities. And we have discussed the works of Marx and Gramsci in this context. Then we have discussed limits of developmentalism as it shapes reforming solutions to global crises, market mechanisms, geoengineering, climate smart agriculture, the population question, green economics, reproductive engineering, transhumanism and so on. And then we have discussed the idea of sustainable development, the agenda of sustainable development goals, transforming our world, the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and what are the flaws. Then we have discussed when we try to search for pluriversal paths, we have discussed ecological wisdom, integrity, resilience, social well-being and justice, direct and delegated democracy, economic democratization, cultural diversity and knowledge democracy. Okay. Now, we are going to discuss in this class, we are going to discuss these 6 points breaking the chains of development through the works of Nemo Bashe, then development for the 1% only by Vandana Shiva, Maldevelopment by Jose Maria Tortosa, the development project by Philip McMichael, the Latin American Critic of Development by Maristola Swampa, and Brics, I mean Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa by Ana Garcia and Patrick Bond. Why I am trying to look at especially these two, I mean the Latin American Critique of Development and Brics, precisely because from the next week we will be engaged in critiques of modernization theory, and then we will move on to the dependency theory, which is a byproduct of the convergence between two intellectual trends, namely neo-Marxism on the one hand and the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America on the other, popularly known as ECLA tradition. Okay? Neo-Marxism on the one hand and the ECLA tradition on the other. Okay? Now, let us start with breaking the chains of development by Nemo Bashe. The key words that we are using for discussing this part, okay, Africa, development, colonialism and climate change. The pursuit of development has promoted, as Bassi argues, butchery on the African continent. The notion that the path to development taken by others is what we must follow is essentially imperialist, used to justify colonialism, neocolonialism and neoliberalism. The fact that this still holds sway is a testament to the resilience of capitalist primitive accumulation. The forces behind these phenomena now promote the enslavement of nature and the enthronement of warfare with ultra-modern weapons. Development in the linear pattern etched by the global north, I mean the developed countries, is a rigged idea that snacks notions into developed and underdeveloped categories. Development study suggests growth, expansion, enlargement and spread, none of which captures the sense of justice or equity or considers the ecological limits of a finite planet. Most African governments have not interrogated the concept of development itself. Political leaders are yet to dissect the fact that the industrialized world got to where it is now through unsustainable exploitation of nature and unjust exploitation of territories and peoples through the process of colonialism. I mean, scholars such as Walter Rodney, Ibequois, Franz Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth, have produced excellent exposés that should have ignited critical introspection. Or perhaps the leaders are not bold enough to reject an unacceptable pathway, having witnessed new agents of imperial powers that assassinated Faso, Sankara of Faso and others who had propagated alternative notions in contradistinction with the notion of development. Does the continuous payment of the so-called social debt to France by its former colonies in Africa not tell of a continent still colonized? What are the indicators of development in Africa, for example? The first, what is being propagated, what has been propagated till now is the gross domestic product, renamed gross domestic problem by Fioramonti in 2013, and when I say as against gross national product, it is the gross domestic product, as against this it is gross domestic problem. This is measured by the extent of physical infrastructure and the amount of currency reserves. A higher degree of both indicates gross domestic product as well as gross domestic problem indicates over extraction of both nature's resources and human resources. The accumulation of foreign reserves bears testimony to the fact that such resources are stored away to support foreign industries and to pay for imports. When nations are liquid according to the parameters of the Bretton Woods twins, namely the IMF and the World Bank, they are quickly encouraged to obtain foreign loans from the holders of their reserves, and once they are in dire straits, they are offered extreme conditionalities that they must meet before the noose can be slackened. The pillage, the global pillage that went with colonialism is often overlooked. Some even see colonialism as a form of aid that helped shine light on an allegedly dark continent. I mean, Hickel in 2015 suggested that the reparations debate is threatening because it completely upends the usual narrative of development. It suggests that poverty in the global south is not a natural phenomenon, but has been actively created, and it casts Western countries in the role not of benefactors, but of plunderers. Hickel further went on to state that there is not enough money in the world to compensate for the evils of colonialism. Today, besides aid from bilateral relations, there are philanthropist foundations that have taken upon themselves the messianic roles of determining Africa's development path and pattern, which ironically is not substantially different from what has already been happening in the name of development. Today, the climate regime is one arena in which the poor in both the global north as well as the global south take all the mitigating actions which the rich and powerful compound the problems. Droughts, famines and water stress grow as governments everywhere neglect socio-cultural and ecological realities in pursuit of foreign exchange. To grab more cash, governments buy the carbon offset and market environmentalism bets and loosen environmental and financial controls for transnational corporations. And these manifest in land grabs and in the displacement of forest communities, either to make way for export oriented monoculture plantations or to lock up forests for carbon stock. The global south, I mean the underdeveloped or the developing countries' new love for foreign exchange and readiness to be a dumping ground for goods leaves it oblivious to how this harms local production. A proliferation of unjust trade rules, trade free zones, violent conflicts and even wars follow. It is instructive to note that all the blood flowing in mineral rich nations such as the Congo has not stopped mineral extraction. Call them blood diamonds or blood crude oil, neither the exploitation of the resources nor their export has stopped. The way out, as Bassi argues, that is to realize that we are in a rigged game and to become agents of social change. But what is the change that we want to witness? At the risk of sounding romantic, one may say that our future may well be found in our past. That is some kind of revivalist trend that we have witnessed, not simply in Africa, but also in India. Okay? That is a problem, right? I mean, Africa has to recover her history and affirm that great steps were recorded in the immediate post-colonial years until the 1980s, when the World Bank forced its so-called structural adjustment programs on her. These were the programs that disrupted social investments and damaged manufacturing and agricultural productivity. Then the artificial boundaries that separate our peoples into various nationalities and foist divisive foreign languages on our peoples require interrogations and resolutions. We will also do well to capture the interconnectivity of our humanity that made the collective basis of communal organizing. The Africa Rising narrative may well be another means of blunting critical reflections on the nature of economic relations among our nations, as Bond argues, as well as with the nations of the global north and China. If the rise is based on conventional GDP figures, these do not reflect the objective realities of the citizens, because the figures are driven mostly by the export of raw materials from the extractive sector. Yet Africa must rise for us to, I mean for Africa to rise, it must hold firmly into the earth, which opens the eyes to our contexts and realities, to the forces that have dominated their culture, beliefs and thought patterns. And that is when we can question the notion of development. That is when we can see the chains around our ankles and break them, and then what Bassi argues that, and then we may sound the call for an African awakening. When we look at Vandana Shiva's reflection on development only for the 1% of the population of the world, the keywords that I am going to use include global crisis, capitalist patriarchal logic, economic violence, poverty, oikos. Oikos means our home. Okay? That is why in the last class we have discussed how economics and ecology, they have their Greek roots in oikos, our home, which has disappeared over a period of time, especially in the world of economics. There is a need to go beyond the discourse on development and gross domestic product as shaped by capitalist patriarchal thinking, and reclaim the true humanity as members of the earth family, as Vandana Shiva argues. What Ronnie Lezum and Alexander Schiffer write, if the fathers of capitalist theory had chosen a mother rather than a single bourgeois male as the smallest economic unit for their theoretical constructions, they would not have been able to formulate the axiom of the selfish nature of human beings in the way they did. What Vandana Shiva here tries to focus on from Lezum and Schiffer, that capitalist patriarchal economies are shaped through war and violence, wars against nature and diverse cultures, and violence against women. And while the objective is to own and control the real wealth that nature and people produce, there is an increasing replacement of material processes with economic fictions such as the logic of competitive markets. Separation is the key characteristic of paradigms emerging from the convergence of patriarchal values and capitalism. First, nature is separated from humans, then humans are separated on the basis of gender, religion, caste and class. This separation of what is interrelated and interconnected is the root of violence, first in the mind and then in everyday actions. It is not an accident that social inequalities of the past have taken a new and brutal form with the rise of corporate globalization. It is often observed today that by current trends, 1% of the global population, or maybe less than 1% of the global population, will soon control as much wealth as the remaining 99%. Today, corporations claim legal personhood over the rights of real people, but the distancing of fictitious constructs from real sources of wealth creation has gone even further. Finance is now substituted for capital with tools and technologies that allow the rich to accumulate wealth as rentiers while doing nothing. Money making in the financial economy is based on speculation, and financial deregulation lets the rich speculate using other people's hard earned wages. The idea of growth has emerged as the measure of success among individuals and governments. It speaks of a paradigm designed by capitalist patriarchal big money just for big money to grow bigger. What the paradigm of economic growth fails to take cognizance of it is the destruction of life in nature and society. Both ecology and economics derived from the Greek word oikos, which means our home. Okay? Both words imply a form of household management. When economics works against the science of ecology, it results in mismanagement of the earth, our home. The climate crisis, the water crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the food crisis are each different symptoms of mismanagement of the earth and her resources. People mismanage the earth and destroy her ecological processes by not recognizing nature as well as the real capital and source of everything else derived from it. Without nature and her ecological processes to sustain life on earth, the grandest economies collapse and civilizations disappear. Under the contemporary neoliberal development model, the poor are poor because less than 1% has grabbed their livelihood, resources and wealth. We see this today in the displacement of both displacement of natural habitat as well as human beings, right. Peasants are getting poorer because the 1% promotes an industrial agriculture based on purchase of costly seeds and chemical inputs. This traps them in debt and destroys their soil, water, biodiversity and their freedom. Okay, what Vandana Shiva in Earth Democracy in 2005 argues how Monsanto Corporation monopolized the cotton seed supply through hyped up marketing of engineered Bt cotton, often forced into debt by purchase of these expensive genetically modified organisms, GMO seeds and other so called green revolution technologies. Some 3 lakh Indian farmers have committed suicide over the since the 1990s. I mean, with most suicides concentrated in the cotton belt. What Vandana Shiva further argues that a rural research firm called Navdanyam, she is the founder of this, to resist these violent monopolies. They try to save the farmers' own traditional varieties of organic cotton to distribute in a movement for safe seed freedom. That seed freedom, I mean, if farmers are getting poorer, it is because the poison cartel now reduced to 3 players. 1, Monsanto Bayer, 2, DuPont and 3, Syngenta Chem China, makes them dependent on buying costly seeds and chemicals. Vertically integrated corporations linking seed to chemicals to international trade to processing of junk food are stealing 99% of the value that farmers produce. They are getting poorer because free trade promotes dumping, destruction of livelihoods and depression of farm prices. Beyond this, small farmers are actually more productive than large industrial corporate farms without using environmentally damaging commercial activities such as fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides and genetically engineered seeds. By contrast, the Global Peasant Union points out that traditional ways of provisioning not only allow more autonomy for farmers, but can even mitigate the effects of global warming. It goes without saying that the growth economy of the 1% is deeply anti-life, and many of these effects are felt by working people in the global north as well. If you look at this, then I mean people everywhere are getting poorer because governments captured by less than 1% impose profit making privatization policies for health and education, transport and energy, reinforced by the Bretton Woods twins, namely the IMF and the World Bank. Mandates, workers, farmers, housewives and nature at large are made into colonies by the dominant capitalist patriarchal economic paradigm. The capitalist model of development by globalization expresses a convergence of 2 forms of violence. 1, the power of ancient patriarchal cultures, and 2, the modern neoliberal rule of money. Okay. Then let us move on to Jose Maria Tortosa's maldevelopment. The key words that we are going to use: basic needs, maldevelopment, underdevelopment, well-being, freedom and identity. The word maldevelopment is partially a reaction to the weaknesses and harmful secondary effects of development as a program. The term underdevelopment became a part of public language after President Truman's 1949 inaugural speech that we have discussed in the initial classes of this course, in which a clear anti-communist slant typical of that time prevailed. In the use of the word development, there is an underlying metaphor taken from biology that living beings develop growing according to their genetic code. It is a process that is natural, gradual, without irregularities and beneficial. In case that this development does not occur, the doctor might intervene, redirecting it, as was stated in the fourth point of that speech, towards the agreement amongst companies and governments of developed cultures to transfer technology and produce growth in underdeveloped ones. But with an exception, the old imperialism exploitation for foreign profit has no place in the plans that Truman delivered. What we envisage is a program of development based on the concepts of democratic fair dealing that is that was claimed by Truman. As in other metaphors, development has the risk of hidden ideology. This is even more so if it is concentrated on the objective of growth expressed as gross domestic product GDP without any type of reference to its limits. GDP based economics implies limitless growth. Leaving out the second part of the biological metaphor, aging, as well as systematically forgetting the relationship between this process and its associated environment. And the metaphor of maldevelopment is different. Living beings suffer maldevelopment when their organs do not follow their code. They become unbalanced and deformed. Its use in social sciences appears to have begun with an article by Sugata Dasgupta in 1967. The classic work was written by Samir Amin in 1990 and was also cited by John Danesky in 1993 with intercontinental participation reflecting discussions of the project. Goals. The title of that project was Goals, Processes and Indicators of Development of the United Nations from 1978 to 1982. It is a metaphor, but unlike development, maldevelopment attempts to refer to verification. First, of the failure on a global scale of the development program, and second to the verification of mal-living that can be observed in the structure and workings of the world system and its components. If development implies a normative element that is desirable, prescriptive element, then maldevelopment contains an empirical component which is observable or even a critical element that is undesirable. Extending the metaphor, consider a medical clinic that starts out from a diagnosis, carries out a prognosis and establishes a therapy in terms of an ideal health, not always well defined, but whose absence tends to be clearly defined and classified as disease. In this sense, maldevelopment can be understood as part of an illness whose components can be numbered according to the numbered on the one hand, and basic necessities, namely well-being, freedom, identity, security and so on the other. And on the other, what we tend to find that there are 3 or 4 levels, local as differentiated from the state, the ecosystem and the world, in which a diagnosis can be carried out. Okay. If you look at this, then you will find that the word maldevelopment does not bring with it a classification more or less contrived of developed and underdeveloped countries. Okay. As it was outlined in Truman's speech in 1949 in the United States of America, along with the proposal that the developed come to the aid of the underdeveloped. The perspective that it offers is different. All countries are in one way or another maldeveloped, and the ultimate reason is their immersion in the world system that produces in a word capitalism, which is where the problem seems to reside. Okay. From here, very quickly we will move on to the development project by Philip McMichael. The key words include development, climate change and food sovereignty. If you look at the mid 20th century development project materialized in the wake of economic depression, World War and decolonization as a blueprint for nation building and a strategy for world order in the context of the Cold War. The United Nations the United States led the post-war reconstruction to stabilize world capitalism and extend its economic empire to the post-colonial world. By describing the so-called third world cultures as undeveloped, the role of colonial exploitation in the rise of the West was erased. Further, idealized Western style industrial development was imposed as the universal standard, as represented in gross national product metrics, as the first world surrogates. The Bretton Woods institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank, served as key financial agencies complementing US aid programs in targeting third world states as commercial clients and gaining access to strategic resources in an anti-communist crusade. Here, even as development was identified as national economic growth, it evolved as market rule on a world scale. Represented as a civilizational improvement on the past and participation in a future and boundless consumption, development is normalized in modern discourse as a seductive inevitability. But development is imagined and measured only on the positive side of the material ledger. However, it has revealed itself to be a paradox, betraying its initial promise. The prospect of endless material prosperity for all via an expanding commodified global market is denied by global inequality with an affluent minority on the one hand and overexploited labor population and ecosystems on the other. Instead of mass consumption, selective enrichment amidst precarious employment situation, rising debt and footloose labor register the paradox. Moreover, increasing entropy is now evident in deteriorating ecological conditions and fragile social institutions, with political and economic elites practicing self-preservation, discounting public needs and a looming climate emergency. A world always with commodities has no environmental sensors, as the United Kingdom's stern review on the economics of climate change in 2006 observed that the world's greatest market value now is climate change. Current neoliberal development amplifies capitalism's focus on short-term gain via or through increasing the velocity of circulation of capital and commodities, juxtaposing short-term economic time with long-term geochemical biological time controlled by the rhythms of nature. For example, when shrimp agriculture, when shrimp aquaculture destroys coastal mangroves, all the shrimp you can eat development undermines not only fish breeding grounds and local livelihoods, but also repositories of biodiversity, carbon sinks and coastal defense against rising seas. Furthermore, while economic claims when economic time claims linear improvement on the past, its past is ever present in climate change. Unfortunately, those humans least responsible for climate change are its most vulnerable. Having been marginalized by development agenda, from extant rural cultures and climate refugees to slum dwellers, a third of the global urban population. From a biophysical perspective, the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment stated that the recent economic development has resulted in a substantial and largely irreversible loss in the diversity of our life on earth, and these problems, unless addressed, will substantially diminish the benefits that future generations obtain from ecosystems. In response, the high level panel of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals initiative observed that environment and development were never properly brought together, adding the somewhat questionable proposal that because we treasure what we measure An important part of properly valuing Earth's natural abundance is to incorporate it into accounting systems. Such a vision extends a particular kind of control over nature in the name of private interest, foreclosing other meanings and uses of land and privileging investor rights over land user rights. Further, it depends the externalization of nature by separating out elements of interactive biophysical processes as ecosystem services commodified in the name of environmental governance and sustainable development. Possibly under an illusion that there remains sufficient natural world to sustain. Sustaining development in a compromised environment is a poor substitute for rehabilitating degraded ecosystems and promoting biodiverse practices. And post-development agendas that we are going to discuss towards the end of this course, very quickly I will try to address this question that addresses these multiple contradictions by embracing principles of natural repair and regeneration, beginning with local responsibility, a variety of rural cultures with low input farming systems producing more than half of the world's food hold this potential. This is the genuine centuries old conventional agriculture. The development narrative concentrating capital and centralizing control has appropriated the term conventional for industrial agriculture, designating low input practices obsolete. But this too is the development paradox. Such initiatives promote natural regeneration to restore rather than ruin diversity. If you look at this, the alternatives that we want to have, Philip McMichael, as he argues that alternative initiatives must promote natural regeneration to restore rather than ruin biodiversity, sequester rather than release emissions, and convert rather than consume energy. These are post-development principles already in existence, orthogonal to market discounting or the act of reducing nature to a commodity. For the survival of humanity and indeed all life on earth, the protection of these materially and socially significant principles is imperative to the sustenance of both rural and urban environments, and in this sense post-development means ending the fetishism of the market fundamentalism. Okay. Now, let us come to the Latin American critique of development by Maristela Swampa. In the Latin American critique of development, the keywords that we are going to use: consumerism, underdevelopment, colonial matrix of power, and extractivism. Critical approaches to the hegemonic notion of development have existed in Latin America since the early discussions of the Club of Rome's limits to growth argument or limits to growth thesis that we are going to discuss in the 11th week of this course, limits to growth thesis and post development. Critics have ranged from debates on sustainable development to contemporary critique of the expansion of the commodity frontier. What Swampa tries to do, she wants to highlight three key movements in Latin American thought: the critique of consumer society. When I say critique of development, I mean critique of consumer society, then critique of post development, and critical perspectives on critique of extractivism. Okay. The first phase, that the critique of consumer society, is best illustrated by Furtado, Brazilian economist, who in gaining distance from classic perspectives of the Economic Commission for United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, argued that one of the indirect conclusions of limits to growth argument was that the lifestyle promoted by capitalism would only be viable for industrialized countries and elite minorities within underdeveloped ones. Any attempt to generalize the consumerist way of life would lead to the collapse of the system, and in the same vein the Argentina based interdisciplinary group, I mean they maintained that behind the report there lay the neo-Malthusian logic characteristic of hegemonic development discourses. Okay. Other concepts in the 1980s similarly emphasized critiques of consumption. Among them were the notion of the human scale development and the theory of human needs developed by Chilean economist Manfred Max Neff. Okay. This, I mean, you can look at Ivan Illich's highly influential notion of conviviality, deschooling and so on. In the first movement, that the critique of consumer society, the thrust of the development critique involved rethinking consumption and cultural patterns in favor of common goods and egalitarian societies founded on more austere lifestyles and longer lasting productive systems. The second movement associated with the post developmentalist perspective centered on development as a discourse of power. If you look at Esteva's works that we have already discussed when we were discussing I mean in the first 2-3 weeks of lectures on development. Okay, I mean basically historical location of the idea of development and end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world, and the desire for development. When we were discussing Esteva's works or Sachs' works, whose elaborated a radical critique emphasizing the colonial matrix of the idea as a post-war invention on the part of the United States and other Western powers. Another notable contribution within this line of thinking was Escobar's deconstruction of the modern concept of development as an instrument of domination, revealing its main mechanisms of operation, the division between development and underdevelopment, the professionalization of development problems and the rise of development experts, and the institutionalization of development through a network of national, regional and international organizations. Escobar highlighted the ways in which development made invisible diverse local experiences, local expertise and knowledge. He further suggested, Escobar further suggested already in the 1990s a shift away from thinking about alternative development towards alternatives to development. The third and current phase in the 21st century, with the critique of existing non-extractivism and the start of the commodity consensus. This phase, the third phase, okay, this third phase spurred a critique of the productivist logic underlying development and of the expansion of extractive mega projects, large scale mining, oil extraction, new agrarian capitalism with its combination of genetically modified organisms and agrochemicals, large scale dams, mega real estate projects and others. Such new forms of extractivism are characterized by the intensive occupation of territories, land grabbing and the destructive appropriation of nature for export. While extractivism refers to the overexploitation and large scale export of primary goods from the third world to the advanced capitalist economies, the notion of commodity consensus suggests that similar to the Washington consensus, there is an agreement increasingly explicit every year around the irreversible or irresistible nature of the current extractivist model. This inevitability forecloses the possibility of considering alternatives to current development models. beyond alleged comparative advantages such as high international prices, these trends have deepened the historic role of the region as a provider of raw materials. It has also intensified asymmetries between the global economic center and its peripheries, as reflected in the trend towards a reprimarization of national economies and the uneven distribution of socio-environmental conflicts. Unlike the previous two analytic phases, namely Critic of Consumer Society and the Critic of Post Development, or the popularly known as the Post Development Critique. Okay. If you look at this 1970s to 1980s, this is 1990s to 2000s, and this one 2010 onward. Okay. The current one, the extractivist, I mean the critique of or the critical perspectives on extractivism has seen explicit resignification of the environmental question, this time in relation to territories, politics and civilization. This environmentalization of struggles, as Enric Leff would say, is reflected in diverse eco-social territorial movements directed against private sector, transnational corporations and the state. Such movements have broadened and radicalized their discursive positions, incorporating other issues such as the critique of monocultural development models. And this politics reveals a crisis of the instrumental and anthropocentric view of nature with its dualist and hierarchical ontology. Ontology means the study of the nature of being. What is being? What is existing? Given this epistemic political landscape, what we are witnessing, that the consolidation of a radical new environmental rationality and post-developmentalist vision. Horizon concepts, if you look at common goods, ethics of care, food sovereignty, autonomy, rights of nature and relational ontologies are key elements of this recent dialectical turn, especially in Latin American critical thought. And this turn synthesizes contributions of previous periods, integrates the critique of consumption models and dominant cultural patterns, and recasts the post-development perspective. Now let us come to Brics: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The keywords that we are going to use here, Brics, sub-imperialism, development banks and multilateral reforms. The Brics, which that states the BRICS states, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa were not initially considered a potential geopolitical bloc, but the world financial crisis in 2008-9 had consolidated the G20, including all the BRICS countries, for the purpose of generating a world response to financial instability based upon short-lived Keynesian principles of state deficit financing, loose monetary policy and lending coordination for bank bailouts. In 2009, the first BRICS summit took place in Russia, creating expectations of a future challenge to the dominance of Western countries in multilateral institutions. At Beijing's behest, South Africa was added in 2010 for continental balance. Okay? Because Brazil from especially from Latin America, Russia represents Europe and a tiny part from Asia, and India and China from Asia, and South Africa represents African continent. Okay? That is why Russia earlier used to be known as Eurasia, okay, when there was Soviet Union. Since then, a contradiction between the BRICS economic potential and their political role in shoring up Western-centric multilateralism has become obvious. For instance, the world crisis offered 4 BRICS states the opportunity to lobby for greater voting power in the IMF during 2010 to 15 quota reform, for which the BRICS contributed $75 billion in recapitalization funds. China's vote rose from 3.8% to 6.1% of the total, but this was at the expense of lowering the input of poorer countries such as Nigeria, whose voting share fell by 41%, Venezuela again by 41% and South Africa again by 21%. High commodity prices and low wages fueled the BRICS accelerated growth prior to the price peak in 2011 and the subsequent crashes in 2015. BRICS based corporations also become major international investors. Economic modernization offers the BRICS a capitalist path to development based on exploitation of the workforce and nature. The BRICS economic growth has been marked by extreme inequality despite their leaders' demand for greater equality in the international system. The BRICS agreement to create a new development bank was signed at the Forjala summit in 2014, the same year that Beijing created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Both banks focus on infrastructure and energy projects, ultimately serving the interests of the extractive and agribusiness industries. That is what Anna Garcia argues, I mean in the Anna Garcia and Patrick Bond. New logistics corridors within and near the BRICS states connect territories and natural resources to foreign country markets such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, generating a major conflict with India over passes through Pakistan controlled Kashmir and Mozambique's Nakala corridor. The rapid operationalization of these new banks is partly due to the initial absence of socio-environmental standards that require impact assessments or negotiations with communities. Although the first set of credits went towards renewable energy projects, the principle of non-interference in internal affairs distinguishes the new development bank from traditional multilateral financial institutions such as the World Bank. And on the contrary, in 2006, the new development bank began wide-ranging operational collaboration with the World Bank, which involved joint participation in project preparation, co-financing and staff exchange. I mean, if you look at this, the Continent Reserve arrangement, which has an initial fund of $100 billion can be activated in the event of a BRICS country balance of payments crisis, but only in a manner complementary to the IMF. A borrowing country must remain an IMF structural adjustment program, otherwise it will be able to borrow only 30% of its quota of contingent reserve arrangement funds. In the case of South Africa, which will be forced to borrow a service of $150 billion debt, that quota is only $10 billion. Thus, both the new development bank and the contingent reserve arrangement function in a complementary way to the Bretton Woods institutions. You can look at similarly within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 4 of the BRICS countries, I mean Brazil, South Africa, India and China, played a central role alongside US President Barack Obama at that time when Obama was the president, in ending the Kyoto Protocol provision for binding emissions cuts. This alliance began at the UN summit in 2008-9 in Copenhagen and continued in 2011 in Durban. It culminated in a non-binding climate deal in Paris in 2015 with numerous fatal laws that include prohibition on climate debt in liabilities. And that deal is beneficial mainly to the historic polluters as well as to the BRICS countries, all of whose economies have a high carbon intensity. To explain this, Brazilian dependency theorist Marini developed the concept of sub-imperialism. This is important. During the 1960s, to identify key countries in imperialism's expansion. Today, the deputy sheriff role strengthens imperialism's ongoing commodification of everything, neoliberal economic policies, mineral and oil extractivism, and repressive control of dissident populations. And as a result, oppositional forces from both the Brics and their hinterlands are mobilizing in solidarity to demand real change, local and global, as a still nascent Brics from below process. Okay. Then what we have discussed today, we have discussed breaking the chains of development through Africa development, colonialism and climate change. Development, Vandanasi was reflections on development for only for the 1% in terms of global crisis, capitalist patriarchal logic, economic violence, poverty and oikos, I mean our home. And then maldevelopment in terms of basic needs, maldevelopment, underdevelopment, well-being, freedom, identity, security and so on. And the development project in terms of development, climate change and food sovereignty. Then we have discussed the Latin American critique of development in terms of consumerism, underdevelopment, colonial matrix of power and extractivism. And then we have discussed Brazil, I mean Brics, I mean Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, sub-imperialism, development banks and multilateral reforms. Okay. We have come to the closure of the 6th week. In the 7th week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to foreground the critiques of modernization theory, how critical variable theories, how dichotomous approaches, they constitute the critique of modernization theory, and then what are the basis of a critique of dichotomous approaches to modernization theory in terms of the ideological critique, in terms of the empirical critique and in terms of the methodological or meta-theoretical critique, that we are going to discuss in the next week in terms of 2 lectures. Thank you.